All right, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot, Jan, for the opportunity to present to this group. I've been lately, as some of you know, I've been working quite a lot on COVID. So for everyone who's interested in COVID, please check out my website. But today I will talk about the research project that has been published in the American Economic Journal Applied Economics, part of it. And it's about emotions, risk, attitudes, and patience. Now I'm based at the University of Lausanne. And what is sort of the traditional view of economists is that, preferences vary very little over time. So we would expect, apart from some noise, there's basically no changes in preferences within individual over time. Now, when you look into the data, you actually see that there is quite some variation. So based on my data set, I see that, around 80% of people have some variation within individuals over time in their willingness to take risks, and we will also see in their general patience. So there is quite some variation here, and the question, of course, is where does this variation then come from? And now what I examine in these two papers is, do emotions drive part of this variation? Now what I use in the data, in the paper here, is large-scale field data. And this is in contrast to what has been previously done, where the evidence is focused on using student samples in experiments. And there has been some evidence on how fear affects willingness to take risks, using, for example, horror movies as one manipulation to induce fear, and then looking at how that affects risk-taking. Now, I use a different approach, namely data from the German socioeconomic panel, where I have roughly 170,000 observations from 34,000 people over the years 2008 through 2016. So really kind of trying to bring this research on emotions and preferences closer to field data. Now, the main ingredients are measures of emotions, as well as measures of risk attitudes and patience. The data on risk attitudes comes from the following question: are you generally willing to take risks, or do you try to avoid risks? Where people can answer in a scale from 0 to 10, from risk averse to fully prepared to take risks. Now, it has been shown, and this might come as a surprise to some economists, but probably not to this audience after the discussion that we just had, that the answer to these questions actually predicts financial decision-making and health behaviors very well. So you can take this general willingness to take risks and then correlate it with behavior in high-stakes laboratory situations, and the predictions work out very well. So for example, a 1-point change in the willingness to take risk scale relates to a 4 percentage point change in the likelihood of being a smoker. And what's interesting is that this willingness to take risks varies within individuals over time. So you see here a plot of the within individual residuals in the willingness to take risks, taking out individual fixed effects. So we see that there is quite some variation within individuals over time in willingness to take risks, which is what we exploit. And then for patients, we also again use a question on general patience, where people can answer on a scale from 0 to 10, from very impatient to very patient. As with the willingness to take risk question, it has been shown that this actually strongly correlates with willingness to with actual behavior. So, for example, 1-point change in the patient scale relates to a 1 percentage point change in the internal rate of return. So again, strong correlations here between this survey measure and actual behavior. Unfortunately, I only have data here for 2008 and 2013 for patients question, 2008, 2013. So 2 waves with 22,000 observations or 11,000 individuals. So I'm a bit constrained in terms of the analysis that I can do here. And what we see here, as with willingness to take risks, there is variation within individuals in patients over time. Now, I link that variation to 4 emotions: anger, fear, happiness, and sadness, where people respond to a question: how often have you felt a certain emotion within the last 4 weeks? So this is really, this is not sort of cognitively evaluated life satisfaction. It's more of an effective measure, more short term, on a scale from very rarely to very often experienced a certain emotion within the last 4 weeks. Now, it has been shown in psychology that it's quite a reliable tool to measure different emotions. And then I show in the paper that these emotions react sensibly to life and external events. So it seems to suggest that they capture, something relevant. And for the paper, I had a previous version of the paper where I didn't combine the two, but here I combined the two. I have happiness and sadness in one emotion measure, but the results are the same if I don't do this.
Sorry, why did you combine them? Because certainly Danny Kahneman makes a point that negative and positive emotions are very different and they shouldn't be on the same scale.
Well, so the reason I combined them was just that I got the feedback from a couple of economists who told me that they find it confusing that basically I include two things that measured the same twice. But, like for like maybe half of the presentations I did of this paper, and in an initial version of the paper, I did have the two separately. So all the results pan out, irrespectively of how you do it. But in the end, it was a bit of a framing choice because I got this advice. But I'm not saying that this is necessarily the smartest choice here. So as I said, as the dependent variable risk attitudes are patients, which I rescale. So instead of scale from 0 to 10, I have a scale from 0 to 100. And then I regress that on all emotions separately on the scale from 1 to 5. And I include person fixed effect. So what I'm really interested in here, what is the covariation between changes in willingness to take risks and changes in those emotions, conditional on individual fixed effect. So that's fairly straightforward. And what I'm interested in is, of course, then the coefficient on these emotions. On top of this, I include individual level controls, household income squared, unemployment, marriage, and whether children are present in the household, and I cluster the standard errors at the individual level. I also have age fixed effects, year fixed effects, and month fixed effects in the main specification. Now, with that, I would like, so I've basically shown you the data that I use, the econometric approach, which identifies this association between these two, constructs. And now I will show you the results for willingness to take risks. Again, descriptive. So we have changes in happiness here on the x-axis. We have changes in willingness to take risks on the y-axis. And these are, residuals. So conditional on individual fixed effects. How does change on the happiness scale relate to change in willingness to take risks? And now what we see is that the more happiness you expressed recently in the last 4 weeks, the more willing are you to take risks. And it's pretty linear and a very strong association here. For anger, we see something quite similar, slightly less strong maybe, but we see that, if you have experienced more anger within the last 4 weeks, you're also more willing to take risks. For fear, we see that if you've experienced more fear recently, you're much less willing to take risks. And again, this is quite a strong association here and fairly linear as well. So we see that there are these, strong relationship between the three emotions, and that's also what we see when we look at the regression output. So here you can see that, adding controls, of course, individual fixed effects explain a lot. That's to be expected. And then, adding more controls doesn't really do anything to these associations. So it's pretty fair. It's a fairly strong predictor having these emotion changes for changes in willingness to take risks. Actually, these relationships are also not just statistically precisely estimated, but they're also substantial. So for example, a 1 standard deviation change in income, which is around 2,000 euros, translates into a 0.5 point change in willingness to take risks, whereas a 1 standard deviation change in happiness relates to a 0.7 point change in willingness to take risks. So, if you compare the standardized impacts here, we talk about a 1.5 times larger association between feelings and willingness to take risks than between income and willingness to take risks. And we also see that, this association of these different emotions corresponds to roughly 1/3 of the association between domain-specific willingness to take risks and general willingness to take risks that we show here. So again, kind of showing that this is a really important association in terms of size. And now you might, of course, kind of be like, okay, is that where it ends? Or like, will he try to make the causal leap? So I can tell you, I will try to make the causal leap, but I don't expect you to buy it. So I will just walk you through some additional results that might kind of indicate that this could be causal. To start out, I go through a bunch of alternative explanations like controlling for wealth, income, and background risk. So I split the sample according to financial assets, according to like large and small income changes and wealth changes. I can control for very soft kind of measures of people's worries about job securities and worries about personal financial situation. And, including all of this does not affect the coefficient estimate. So I would not say it's clearly that it's clearly the case that wealth, income, and background risk drive these associations. I can also look at business cycle variation, controlling for economic policy uncertainty, or for different business cycles across different states within Germany, which could also potentially be a driver of these associations. But again, there is nothing going on here. Surprisingly, maybe to some of you, it's also not completely explained by subjective health changes. So happiness still is strongly associated with willingness to take risks, even controlling for subjective health, although the coefficient gets a little bit smaller. And I also look at psychological explanations such as life satisfaction and previous risk taking. Now, even controlling for life satisfaction, there is residual variation in happiness that in sort of more short-term happiness that correlates with willingness to take risks. So these associations, they are not driven by life satisfaction. So it's important to say that life satisfaction on its own is correlated the same way as happiness is correlated with willingness to take risks. So if you're more satisfied with your life, you're more willing to take risks. So if you get more satisfied with your life with an individual, you get more willing to take risks in this sample. But this does not explain the emotional relationships. So I think that's quite interesting, and maybe you can discuss a bit more later on about this result as well.
Armando, can I come in?
Yeah.
I was thinking of leaving that towards the end, but you're putting it so strikingly. So yeah. Have you seen Andrew Oswald and my paper in GBO, probably back in 2014, where we link life satisfaction to risk-taking identified or signaled by whether or not people wear their seatbelt, or whether or not people get involved in motor vehicle accidents subsequent to the well-being measurement, of course. We find the exact opposite. So there's people with lower life satisfaction who are less happy, who are more likely to take these day-to-day physical risks. The argument that Andrew and I put forward is is somewhat sensible and very economically in nature, which is that if you value your life less, i.e. you're less satisfied with it, you care less for it, i.e. you will take more of these, you'll be more careless. And that gets picked up in these items.
Can I follow up with Jan's comment? It seems to me that one thing that would be helpful, it's really good work, I'm really excited by, but how do you define risk? Because there's risk, which is like deciding to invest in an expensive graduate degree. Assume, there's some risk that you won't have a payoff later, but you probably will. And not wearing seatbelts, which is kind of a stupid risk. And I'm not saying this very eloquently, but right now there's no definition in what you're talking about, and I think it would help.
Yes. Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there is not more to it than like really this general willingness to take risk question. What I do in the paper is I look at domain-specific willingness to take risk as well, which includes financial domain and so on. And if for the happiness coefficient, for the effective measure, for this emotional measure, it's consistently positive across these different 4 or 5 domains that I can look at. But I totally agree that, for certain behaviors, particularly for the life satisfaction measure, it could pan out very different. So I think, Jan, that, your results seem very plausible to me. So I would think that, people who are happy are more likely to wear seat belts. But yeah, apparently in terms of their willingness to take risks, in sort of answering this question, in general, how willing you are to take risks, they say that they're more willing to take risks, even conditional on the individual fixed effects and other observables. So this is, for me, I think it's an interesting puzzle that I would be very curious to see more research on, because I think at the moment the problem in this literature is that there is not so much research on this in the first place. I mean, Jan is one of the only papers, and then there are a couple of others. So I think the goal with this paper was also a bit or like what my motivation was to show economists emotions are kind of interesting and cool, and we should study them more. But I think there's a lot more to be done here, and to understand kind of where do these differences between life satisfaction and emotions come from, yeah, how can we explain that there is this residual variation in emotion that still explains willingness to take risks, even though we control for life satisfaction, for example. So I think there are a couple of interesting aspects here to look at. Yes, I will show some results on behavior as well later on, which might also to some extent help a little bit with this concern. So in the next step, I do an event study to again kind of tease out, how robust is this relationship between changes in like willingness to take risks and changes in emotions. So what we see is that immediately in the survey wave after the death of a parent or a child, we see that positive emotions drop quite strongly. I mean, this is to be expected. Positive emotions here being an index of happiness and fear. Anger is not affected on average, and also across different subgroups of the population around this event. But when you look at positive emotions, you clearly see, or like happiness and fear, you clearly see a drop. So people report less happiness and more fear at around the death of a parent or a child. Now, what we would hope for in a way, if this association would be robust, is that we see pretty much exactly the same picture for willingness to take risks. And this is what we do. So we see that immediately in the survey wave after the death of a parent or a child, willingness to take risk is lower. And we see also that the development is consistent with the emotional development. So there is nothing happening before the death of a parent or a child. Then there is this drop immediately in the survey wave after the death of a parent or a child. And then we go back to baseline. Now, I kind of use this also in an IV strategy. So the idea is here to take out any differences that there might be before and after the death of a parent or a child, to also take into account maybe, information shocks that come in and that are stable. So we want to take those out. So I take out level differences here as well. But as you've already seen on the figure, that shouldn't matter. I focus on individuals who experience a death in the sample period. I drop individuals who receive inheritance, but it doesn't matter if I include those. And I end up with 1,200 deaths here that I can look at. Now, in order to give this a causal interpretation, what do we need to assume? Well, first, that the exclusion restriction holds, so that there is no disproportional change in other variables at the time of the death when compared to the difference before and after death. So this is really like immediately exactly the same pattern that we've seen for emotions and risk attitudes. We don't want to see this pattern for any other variable, right? So I look whether this pattern exists for any other variable that I can kind of capture and that makes sense to look at. So I look at marital status, wealth, income, employment, worries about money. I can also combine all of those, and there is nothing going on in terms of the same pattern that we see for emotions and a willingness to take risks. Then another point is, well, maybe some individuals feel different about the death of a parent or a child than others, but that doesn't seem really to be the case. So what we see here is a confirmation of the main regression result. So if you have had more positive emotions as instrumented by the death of a parent or a child, or less positive emotions, it means that when you had less positive emotions, you were less willing to take risks. When you had more positive emotions, you're more willing to take risks. So this just shows you, if you use this kind of event study approach, you still see a similar pattern than for the association in the panel data that I've shown you. And now maybe I can go a little bit to the concern that was voiced about, how does this map to behavior? Now, there are two pieces of evidence that I look at in the paper. One is in the cross-section. I look at whether people who were happier are more likely to invest in a bank account. Again, I use an investment, an IV strategy where I look at the death of a close, sort of a close friend or colleague. And I see that people who lost a close friend or colleague in a very different data set from Holland, I see that those people are less likely to choose the risky investment, which is investing in the stock market, and they're more likely to opt for the bank account. And this data was collected by a completely different set of researchers. And it was like, I just linked these two distinct data sets because it's possible to do this in this data, but none of the researchers had any of these kind of questions in mind. So this is cross-sectional, but it shows that basically the same pattern holds true in the cross-section when it comes to actual behavior, looking at the death of a close colleague or friend. Then we have another paper.
Sorry, Armando, just really quickly. Did you control for age here? Because presumably people who have close friends that die or children who die are on average older, right?
Yes.
And they're less likely, if they're just smart investors, to not choose risky investments at that point in their lives. I don't, does that come into play, or are you controlled for age?
Yes, I control for it, yeah. And then we also have another paper where we see that people, you know, when it comes to voting, they choose the status quo when they're in a bad mood. So overall, you know, before moving on to the results for patients, I would say that, you know, these emotions are strongly associated and potentially causally influence willingness to take risks and actual risk taking. And then I have a second part that was originally part of this paper that was published, but I hope to make this now into a new paper. So maybe we can also have a short discussion of what you think, you know, whether this is interesting enough, whether this might have some potential. But it's, you know, very similar in terms of method and so on. So we see, you know, again, like these residual plots here, how is residual happiness correlated with patients? We see, you know, people who were happier recently, they report higher patients as well. For anger, we see that people who have recently experienced anger, they are much less patient. And then for fear, we see no strong correlation between the two. Now, again, you can go through all these alternative explanations. Could it be risk attitudes, what I showed just before? That doesn't seem to be the case. It also doesn't seem to be the case that it's personal or general economic circumstances that drive this relationship. And life satisfaction plays a role actually here for the happiness patients association. So if you're more satisfied with your life, you're more patient, and that explains to a large extent the relationship between happiness and patience, but it does not explain the relationship between anger and patience. Unfortunately, because I just have 2 years of data, I cannot do an event study here. Now, in terms of mechanisms, I will just give you a very rough overview. I looked at different options of why emotions map to willingness to take risks and patience. One could be that, you know, it's like kind of emotions affect expectations, and this is why you're different, you have a different willingness to take risks, or it could be a direct impact of emotions and preferences. The data seem to suggest here it's probably more likely to be a direct impact. I can look at whether feelings of control, which is one main explanation voiced in psychology. So the appraisal tendency framework in psychology states that emotions map to willingness to take risks and patience based on how much in control a person feels in a certain situation. And I tried to look at this a little bit in the paper, and it seems somewhat consistent with the data that I can use here. Then one aspect could be that, you know, once people exert self-control, all these relationships vanish. So people with high self-control, they will not have these relationships. It will only exist for people who have low self-control, but that's not the case. So for anger, people who have high self-control, there the association is actually weaker, but for the other emotions, it doesn't matter whether you're high or low self-control, the associations are there in both subsamples. So in summary, what we've seen is, you know, residual happiness correlates strongly with willingness to take risks. So if you had more recent positive emotions, you're more willing to take risks. If you have more fear, you're less willing to take risks. if you've experienced anger, you're more willing to take risks. And for patients, we see that, you know, when you've been more happy or more patient, that's also consistent with previous literature. And when you've been more angry, you're less patient. And again, I mean, it remains to be seen, you know, what this means across different domains of willingness to take risks. Why do we have this residual explanatory power of emotions versus life satisfaction? And what's the difference between the two in explaining behavior and willingness to take risks? So the key takeaway I would give here is there is a robust correlation between emotions and preferences in a field setting. And potentially, you know, if you buy some of the assumptions, it seems that there could likely be a causal effect of emotions. And that would also be consistent with you know, a big body of work in psychology looking at emotions and willingness to take risks in the lab. So in summary, emotions drive variation and risk attitudes in patients. I'm very grateful for the comments so far, and I'm happy to discuss more about this topic. I also have 2 questions in case there are not more questions from your side. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Armando. That was brilliant. Wow. And right on time. And again, we would not expect any less from a Swiss academic. Thank you.